I'm Harvey Mansfield. This is the Government Department's Political Theory Colloquium, co-sponsored today by the Program on Constitutional Government and being held in the spacious Government Department. Great Gray Green Government Department is the way we call it when we're in a lighthearted mood. This speaker today is Robert C. Bartlett, who's a professor at Boston College. He's not just a professor, he's a Behrakis Professor of Hellenic Political Studies at Boston College. And he's a graduate of the U of T, which means University of Toronto, and he got his MA and PhD from Boston College, that very same place. And his specialty is ancient political philosophy, but he's also done some work on the moderns. He's the author of several, it's in between several and many books, I would say. Yeah. The first one is called The Idea of Enlightenment, in which he takes the notion of enlightenment and applies it to the ancients. And I think a move which has attracted some followers in the years following that, the publication of that book, which was in the 90s.
No, 2001.
The
years begin to blur.
All right. Yeah.
2001.
And he's written on Plato's Protagoras and Meno, Xenophon's shorter Socratic writings. And his newest work is a translation of Aristotle's Ethics, which he did with Susan Collins, and which has also appeared very recently and is doing well. He is working on a book on Plato's Protagoras and Theocritus, of which today's presentation is a small spark. And so this is Robert Bartlett, and he's going to talk on sophistry as a way of life, how to make it work for you.
Thank you, Professor Mansfield. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Professor Mansfield indicated, this is related to kind of a bigger project that I'm working on. And I confess that I was going to, when I was invited to come, I was going to trot out something one of the several things I trotted out in the past and give it, which may have been the safer thing to do, surely would have been the safer thing to do, but rather dull for me. So I decided in the last 10 days or so to try to write something new. I've been teaching the two dialogues that I'll speak about today, the two Platonic dialogues, the Protagoras and the Theocritus, so it's been on my mind. In fact, the project as a whole, the questions that are bound up with those two dialogues have been on my mind for a while. So in a way, I'm putting this forward for the first time, and I look forward to our exchanges about it. So this is very new to me in a way. I'm going to begin maybe by reading a quotation that is ultimately related to my paper, although it'll take a while to get there. It's from Maimonides, The Guide of the Perplexed. Now, we've already said and explained that this doctrine of the eternity of the world can be arranged in a coherent way only through a recourse to the law of necessity, and that necessity contains a presumptuous assertion with regard to the deity. Now, my main aim this afternoon is to urge the students here, and almost everybody here is a student, maybe everybody is here is a student. I want to urge the students especially those who haven't settled on a doctrine to call their own or even a way of life, to consider sophistry. Consider sophistry as a way of life. If you judge from the extant records, there's a lot to recommend sophistry, I think. The pleasures attending comfortable wealth, for example, and fame or honor in certain circles, all of it gained with some hard work but no sweat. It's true that the reputation of sophists has had its ups and downs. Plato apparently treated them very roughly, but then again his Socrates maintained that, quote, the biggest sophists were in fact political communities which did much more damage to the soul of a young person than some lone teacher ever could. In our time, Martin Heidegger treated Protagoras in particular with much the same respect he accorded Descartes. And Richard Rorty explicitly allied himself with Protagoras. Now, I know the usual case against sophistry, and that is that it amounts to the prostitution of something high, wisdom, science, knowledge, for the sake of something low. But what if wisdom consists in coming to see that little or no knowledge is really available to us? That we can't hold a mirror to nature. If the high doesn't exist, the supposedly low ceases to repel us, and life is short. But what's a sophist? If we follow the example of Heidegger, we should probably return to the beginning to answer that question. And for me, at least, that means to Plato's unsurpassed portraits of the sophists. And so what I want to do for the remainder of this afternoon is to make some introductory remarks about Plato's two-part presentation of the sophist of antiquity, Protagoras, in the dialogue named after that man, and then in the first two-thirds or so of the Theaetetus, in which Protagoras appears. And I want to speak first about the moral or political teaching of Protagoras. But there's a kind of preliminary difficulty, because the task of recovering Protagoras' understanding of himself and of the world is complicated. It's complicated by the fact that he rarely speaks his mind, or that he is, to use the Greek phrase, an immensely clever speaker. Now, Protagoras does present himself to the world as a sophist, the first to do so, according to him. He's therefore marked by a certain outspokenness or frankness. His name happens to mean, by the way, first to speak out. This outspokenness is remarkable in that those known or even suspected to be sophists were deeply mistrusted by many respectable people. For example, the future accuser of Socrates, Anytus, a very respectable democratic statesman, despised sophists. You see this in the Meno. Even young Hippocrates of the Protagoras, whose eagerness to study with the sophist affords the occasion for the whole dialogue, even he blushes at the thought of becoming a sophist himself. That's not what he wants to do. And yet Protagoras admits that such frankness is itself a mark of his prudence or the product of calculation. The bad job of concealment done by the crypto-sophists before him, he says, only served to exacerbate the problem. They denied being sophists, they got caught out and made things worse. And besides, Protagoras has devised certain other, unspecified means of concealment that have permitted him to practice sophistry for decades, so far unscathed, dangerous though he says that practice still is. Protagoras therefore trumpets a frankness that is in fact far from complete, and that's guided not by, say, respect for honesty, but by the demands of self-protection as he understands those demands. And as will be confirmed later in the Theaetetus, where we learn that the now deceased Protagoras used to teach one thing to what he calls the unwashed many, while reserving his, quote, secret teaching for his students, Protagoras is a consummate liar. He avails himself of myths and other such means of indirections that have kept him safe for all these years. But why? Why does Protagoras need to proceed as indirectly as he does? If you strip away the dazzling rhetoric and you follow up on his hints, we arrive, I think, at this understanding of the man. Protagoras contends that the so-called virtues of moderation, piety, and justice are in fact tools that every community relies on to transform naturally isolated and selfish human beings into unnatural citizens, sheep, who obey the law more or less willingly. In doing that, they serve mostly the good of others while sacrificing their own, virtuously as they're taught to think, but stupidly in fact. According to Protagoras, then, human beings are not by nature political animals, except in the very indirect sense that they attempt to form societies in order to flee the horrors of our truly natural condition. Now, it hardly needs to be said that Protagoras is also an atheist, a fact he cleverly conveys, even as he speaks with apparent respect of Zeus and Hermes and the rest. Anybody who's actually unjust would be crazy to admit to that injustice, Protagoras notes. And his deed here in the famous long speech that he gives suggests that it's a good idea, too, to promote in other people the idea of a law-giving God in heaven who unfailingly punishes the unjust. That's the core of his speech. And once we are rid of the good that justice and piety are supposed to be in themselves or for their own sakes, it's a short step, I think, to identifying pleasure as the good that remains, namely one's own pleasure. Pleasure is a good whose immediacy and certainty bespeak the natural in a way that the demands of justice or piety or moderation can't match. Protagoras is a hedonist. But by the time that question is broached in the Protagoras, he's been having a very hard time of it because Socrates has suddenly become very impolite and insistent. And so Protagoras has been rendered too incautious to cop to hedonism. He'll say only that considerations of, quote, safety, with a view to his life as a whole, lead him to pursue only what he calls noble pleasures. As a punishment for this caution, by the way, Socrates proceeds to give, on the basis of an avowed hedonism that has baffled many commentators, a much better advertisement for sophistry than anything Protagoras had said up to that point. So if we put this all together, we see that Protagoras is an atheistic, an amoral hedonist, I repeat myself. He conceives of a world that is beyond good and evil, though not beyond good and bad, because we can be guided in it by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. If there are delights to be had in figuring things out, important things out for ourselves, then surely Protagoras takes no small pleasure in lifting the curtain that conceals the true character of polite society, in seeing with a kind of godlike strength the utter falsity of the deepest opinions that guide most people most of the time. And what does all this mean for the life he actually leads? He's in the first place a very famous and wealthy teacher. His arrival in Athens, which is recorded in the Protagoras, causes something of a sensation even outside of the likely circles. The case for pursuing fame and wealth is easier to make on the basis of hedonism, because even if you insist that fame and wealth are in themselves trifles, they lead to pleasures nonetheless. And as for Protagoras' activity as a teacher, it has to be complex. When we first see Protagoras in the dialogue named Protagoras, in the home of Callias, he's walking around in a private home. He's surrounded by students, some of them locals, some of them foreigners, whom Plato says he attracted with him from town to town, and they followed him, following his Orpheus-like voice. Now, closer inspection suggests that, in fact, there's an inner circle of students who are surrounded at some remove by others. And that inner circle includes one fellow named Antimoiras, who's a foreigner, who is Protagoras' A-plus student and is the only one said to be studying to become a sophist himself. In contrast to him, the vast majority of Protagoras' paying pupils are, like young Hippocrates, attracted by the promise of realizing political ambition. To these students, he presumably conveys the principles of, say, effective rhetoric, so that they can become, quote, most powerful in speaking about the city's affairs. It's one of his explicit promises. Whatever else Protagoras teaches these young people about the so-called virtues and gods, it has to be compatible with the persistence of political ambition, or not act as a corrosive on that ambition entirely. To repeat, all but one of those in his train have political ambitions and don't seek to become sophists themselves. If we judge by the life that Protagoras himself leads, as an itinerant teacher and therefore a perpetual foreigner, he must be without political ambitions in any ordinary sense himself. His concern with politics, which is the realm of the merely conventional, after all, it seems limited to avoiding the ire of the few powerful people in the city, as distinguished from the majority, mere fools, according to him, who perceive as it were nothing. Protagoras has to have a largely political teaching, then, that appeals to and to some extent aids the political ambitions of the young. And some versions of this teaching keep intact the students' basic moral opinions. Why do I say that? Because at one point Protagoras boasts that although his fees are very high, he allows students to pay whatever they think the instruction is worth once the instruction is over, a policy I myself would never follow. But he says with one important caveat, if you think it's worth less than the advertised price, then you have to go to a temple and swear before the god that it's only worth that much. So Protagoras too relies on or exploits the piety of at least some of his students, and therefore he has no incentive to undermine it altogether. But as for his theoretical teaching to the likes of an Antimoiras, the core of it is not in the Protagoras, but in the first two-thirds of the Theaetetus. So let me turn to that. Early on in his conversation with the very gifted young mathematician Theaetetus, after whom the dialogue is named, Socrates resurrects the dead Protagoras, one of the miracles he performs in this dialogue. And he has him both explain himself and defend himself. And Socrates does this because the young fellow's second attempt at a definition of knowledge is nothing other than perception, amounts to the same thing, according to Socrates, as Protagoras' famous dictum that, quote, human being is the measure of the things that are, that they are, and of the things that are not, that they are not. Now, Socrates gradually transforms Theaetetus's maybe commonsensical suggestion of the crucial importance of sense perception to knowledge. He transforms that into Protagoras' momentous contention that each one of us can know only the world constituted by our necessarily private or individual perceptions of things. We can know only the content or character of our perceptions, not the things in themselves that somehow give us or cause those perceptions. Still less can we know the fundamental cause or causes of the coming into being, persistence, and perishing of the things as what they are, or of the world that would seem to be constituted by the sum of those things. Now, Socrates sets forth this doctrine, which is a mix of Theaetetus's and Protagoras'. He sets it forth in stages, each one appearing to be somewhat more radical or far-reaching than the preceding one. And so, to look ahead at the end of the road, attempting to track down Protagoras' final view is a tall order, even leaving aside the fact that he lies so much. Protagoras' doctrine of human being as measure is sometimes linked with the thought that all things are constantly in motion, i.e. changing, both perceiver and perceived, actions active as well as passive. And it includes at one point the assertion that there are no fixed forms or classes, no eidae. These instead are constructions in human speech, traceable, he says, to communal habit and a lack of precisely knowledge. According to what may well be the final stage of the exposition of Protagoras' doctrine, here I'm trying to give a snapshot of the whole, not only can we not speak intelligibly of beings any longer, but even becoming should be banished from our thought. For if there are no intelligible classes or kinds, then there can be nothing fixed that persists through the process of coming into being or becoming. And so Socrates' very attempt to capture Protagoras' doctrine in speech amounts to assigning, in violation of the doctrine, a fixed characteristic, for example, constant motion, to things that cannot be known to be such. In violation of the doctrine, Socrates attempts to bring the world to a halt by describing in speech what is its finally ineffable motion. Partly as a result of this difficulty, I think, Socrates' account of Protagoras' doctrine, especially inasmuch as it's linked with the motion doctrine, is itself constantly in motion. And so it presents indeed, or before our eyes, the central contention of the argument, a sort of explanation by way of imitation. Now, Protagoras seems to have begun from reflection on the readily available experience of sense perception. One of us, he says, may be chilled by a wind that another doesn't experience as cold at all. Of the wind itself by itself, we cannot say anything. The qualities of the wind depend for their existence entirely on their being perceived and hence on the perceiver. But this proves to be only a preliminary stage of the argument. This is what he says is for the unwashed many, I'm afraid. More serious is Protagoras' so-called secret teaching, intended for students only, of the fundamentally relational character of our experience of the world. All the qualities we assign to things as we experience them depend on the act of contrasting and comparing. Quote, if you address something as big, it will appear also small. And if heavy, light, and in fact all things together are this way, on the grounds that there is no one thing that either is something or is of any sort whatever. In addition, he says, all the things that we assert are, and wrongly address as such, in fact come into being through varieties of motion, locomotion, motion, mixing together. For nothing ever is, but is always in the process of coming into being, hence of changing. Socrates turns to pursue Protagoras' argument, and he does so by giving an account of how we experience color. This explanation stresses the centrality of the isolated experience of the perceiver, and the impossibility of supposing that a given color is in the thing perceived. There is no white stick or red ball. More important still is the example Socrates gives next of 3 dice. 4 dice set next to 6 dice will prompt us to say that the 6 are more than the 4, and by half as much as the 4. But when 12 dice are set next to the 6, the original 6, we'll say that the 6 are fewer than the 12, and by half as much as the 12. There is here both a striking fixity. The 6 dice remain throughout what they are, a collection of 6 like things that we group together as a unit, 6, and a disorienting motion. The 6 are both more and less, greater and fewer simultaneously. Now, from this example, Socrates indicates that we have to abandon the following otherwise very powerful thoughts: that nothing could ever become greater or lesser in bulk or number while remaining equal to itself, and that whatever something was not previously, it could not subsequently be without becoming and having come to be. In other words, to put it positively, the 6 dice do become lesser while remaining equal to themselves. And they do subsequently become what they were not previously, while undergoing no change in themselves. These examples, I think, are meant to bring home to us how much the qualities we assign to things, as though they were inherent in them, depend somehow on the active presence of the classifying mind. And with what confidence can we speak of the things themselves, those that bear these unstable qualities? It's nevertheless possible to give on this basis an explanation of what's happening, so to speak, behind the world of our perception. He gives here a second account of our perception of color. An explanation that classifies kinds of motion according to their active and passive qualities, among other things. But Socrates dubs this account to explain what's going on behind the world of our perception a myth. Why? Because it's at most a plausible hypothesis. It turns out, according to the comprehensive conclusion that Socrates here draws, that we really cannot speak of any form, any eidos, not even of a human being anymore. All such terms, as I said before, are devices we use to bring to a halt in speech what is in fact ceaselessly in motion and therefore changing. And when, at the end of Protagoras' vigorous rebuttal of the charge, that everybody reasonably distinguishes between true and false perceptions, hence the perception as such can't be knowledge, we're evidently left with his contention that there is no ground on which to deny to anyone the truth for the individual of her perceptions, she who as perceiver is constantly changing in the midst of a world that is also constantly in motion, at least as Protagoras perceives it. To sum up the theoretical portion, Protagoras' position, so far as I can see, denies the possibility of knowledge and even of saying very much about the world at all, as distinguished from our individual perceptions. His stance divides this thing we call the world into greater awareness of individual perception, on which each of us is wholly and necessarily dependent, on the one hand, and the utter mysteriousness of all that may lie behind or cause that perception on the other. Now let me see if I can put the two dialogues together. The closest points of contact between Protagoras' view of political virtue and his theoretical doctrine are found first in the atheism on display in the Protagoras. That, after all, is a theoretical position. According to the details of his famous myth, the world is fundamentally epimethean, as distinguished from promethean. There's no forethought, in other words. Thought or mind is subsequent to. It's the product of dumb matter in motion. There is no divine mind prior to the world that brought the world into being and governs it, which is confirmed, of course, by his account of the misery of our existence in the absence of human invention and discovery. The second point of contact, it seems to me, between the two dialogues consists in the application of Protagoras' thoroughgoing relativism, or his motion doctrine, to things just and noble, as the Greek puts it, or to what we would call morality. This happens at first, very briefly or in passing. Young Theaetetus is asked by Socrates whether he would include the things that are just and good in the flux, and he says, yes, I think I would. And then they move on, as if the world had not just fallen apart. It's helpful in seeing the implications of Protagoras' theoretical doctrine if we look at Socrates' first, I think, important criticism of him, which is strange. He wonders why Protagoras didn't begin his famous book called Truth by stating that a pig or a baboon or some other still stranger thing possessed of perception is the measure of all things. In other words, why a human being? Why not a pig or a baboon as the measure of all things? For although we think of Protagoras as being, quote, like a god, his argument suggests that all human beings are equally wise, in that they all have equally correct and true perceptions. Far from being above human beings in the manner of a god, then, it's hard to see why Protagoras is wiser than any sentient being, even a baboon. And so why pay him large fees for his wisdom, as Socrates rather impolitely asks? In response, Protagoras tries to shut Socrates down. He denies that his thesis has been touched in any way by these criticisms. Quote, I assert that the truth is as I have written. Each of us is the measure of the things that are and that are not, but one person differs vastly from another in this, in that some things are and appear to one, others to another. What's more, Protagoras contends that he can speak meaningfully of wisdom and the wise. I say that this very person is wise. Whoever effects a change in any one of us, to whom bad things appear and are, such that good things appear and are. It's not a question of true or false, then, but of better and worse, of healthier and sicker. The doctor, his example, by means of drugs, will alter the patient's perception of the bitterness of what he eats, a perception due to a defective state of body. But of course, Protagoras is less concerned here with doctors and healthy bodies than he is with politics. He contends that, quote, the wise and good orators cause the useful instead of the harmful things to seem to the cities to be just. You may note the lack of parallelism there. He elaborates, such things as seem in the element of opinion to be just and noble to each city also are for it, for so long as it believes in them or recognizes them. It falls to the wise orator, in other words, to present what's useful to a city, a proposed treaty, say, or a war, to present what's advantageous as just and noble, moral to the community. And if the skilled orator can persuade the city that a given treaty is just or moral, it actually becomes just, unlike the useful or advantageous. Why? Because justice here owes its existence entirely to being held or recognized. So a treaty may prove to be suicidal for a city, however advantageous it may have been held to be in opinion. But whatever a city holds to be just is by that fact alone just for it. Justice then is relative to the city and can't trace its existence to anything else apart from that opinion. Protagoras' statement that human being is the measure implies a relativism in regard to the beings generally and in regard to the just and noble things or morality. It doesn't extend, however, to the good. You could even say that his position rests on the fixity of the good, on the knowable character of the good. To be meaningful, such categories as healthy and sick, useful and harmful, and so on, depend on the possibility of knowing what's good for a plant, animal, human being, or a city. These are all his examples. But in what seems to me to be the greatest mystery, in a very mysterious dialogue, Socrates suddenly raises the possibility that he was wrong to have had Protagoras concede that some are superior to others in wisdom because they have a superior understanding of better and worse. In other words, could it be that Protagoras affirms the relativity of even the good? Socrates immediately indicates how hard that would be to consistently deny that some are wiser than others. He says in times of crisis, don't we look to people whom we know have superior knowledge, the bomb disposal expert and so on. For salvation, he says, just as if they were gods. And Socrates proceeds to give the version of Protagoras' argument that stands up best, one that affirms the relativity of morality, but denies the relativity of the good. But I don't think we can understand the dialogue if we don't see that Socrates attributes this apparently stronger version to, quote, all those who do not, in every respect, state Protagoras' argument. In other words, Socrates' final word here suggests that Protagoras may well maintain the relativity of the good in addition to morality. This means that whatever a city holds to be just, pious, or good is just, pious, or good for it. there being no referent in the world against which to measure such opinions. But why does Socrates insist, as he does here, on drawing our attention to so radical a possibility? He raises the question whether Protagoras could still dare to have the courage to include the good in the flux. What might prompt him to include the good in that flux? Because doing so reduces to essentially nothing our knowledge of the world. I hope this is clear. So there's a radical relativism with regard to the moral things, which is old hat, at least in pre-Socratic thought, and not only pre-Socratic thought. And then Socrates says, well, wait a minute, maybe he even goes farther than I suggest and includes even the good. And then it's left sort of open whether that's his position. And the question is why? Socrates proceeds to argue that each individual may well be the only judge of his own sense perceptions. Fine. But, quote, shall we assert, Protagoras, that the sorts of things the individual supposes will be also come to be for him who made the supposition? This new argument concerning the knowledge of the future helps us understand why courage might be needed to dare to make the argument that Protagoras was at least attempted to make about the good. Why? What is so important about knowledge of the future? Every expert claims knowledge of specific things in the future: physician, farmer, musician, and so on. Those are his examples. But doesn't one kind of expertise make special claims about knowledge of the future more broadly? Doesn't the knowledge of the future belong especially to those who claim special access to the world and its workings? And there are, of course, those who do make such a claim. Nobody would converse with Protagoras and pay him a lot of money if, quote, he didn't persuade his associates that neither a prophet nor anyone else would be a better judge of what will be and will seem than he himself is. But it isn't only Protagoras' business prospects that depend on the successful demonstration of the inadequacy of the prophet's claim to knowledge. The very possibility of the philosophic enterprise or science depends on it. Any adequate answer to the question, what is knowledge, which is the question of the Theaetetus, any adequate answer to that has to include an account of the obstacles to knowledge, and especially of its possibility. And for so long as a complete account of the world's origins remains beyond our grasp, that is, a complete account of how the world came into being and why it persists as it does, it would seem to be impossible to know whether such order as we observe in the world is due to a mutable will or an immutable nature. This, it seems to me, is the fundamental question. Philosophy or science is possible only if nature can be known to exist, if the law of necessity, that brooks no interruption, is set down for all time. And I might add, in passing on the authority of Aristotle, also in such a way that the objects of science are themselves eternal. Above all, philosophy or science is possible only if the philosopher or scientist can somehow be certain that the claims to special knowledge of those who deny natural necessity or causation are false. And I contend that very much to his credit, Protagoras was aware of this difficulty, and he responded to it in his manner, by including the good in the unknowable flux. But what contribution does this make to his cause? It would seem that neither the individual character of sense perception, nor even the assertion of the relativity of what is just and pious, is sufficient from Protagoras' point of view. As Protagoras himself had insisted at an earlier stage of the argument, the possibility of wisdom depends on knowledge of the good. No knowledge of the good, no wisdom. Could it be that being without a refutation of the competing claim to knowledge of the world raised in behalf of gods or the divine, and yet being unwilling, maybe as a matter of taste or inclination, to accede to that divine claim, Protagoras chose to destroy the world. And the world's resistance to the inquiries of the human mind supply no small warrant for his view, I think it should be said. Protagoras knows that he cannot prove the believer to be wrong. Instead, he retreats into an extreme relativism that at a minimum protects his own view of the world from attack. I know only that you cannot know that I am wrong. Or, your conviction that you're a god, the example is Theaetetus's. Your conviction that you're a god may be true for you, but there's no discernible necessity for me to accept it as true for me. The extreme version of Protagoras' relativism, then, may not so much defend philosophy as fend off faith. He doesn't have to believe in Zeus as objectively true. And if you too come to perceive the world as he does, neither do you. Once we see this theological difficulty, which I think is at the core of the Theaetetus, earlier and puzzling sections of the dialogue begin to make more sense, I think. For example, at one point, Socrates persists in raising this question with Protagoras, and Protagoras gets annoyed. He says this, "You are seated together and make public speeches, and you bring gods into our midst here, gods whom I excise from both my speaking and writing, as to whether they are not." In other words, I don't go there, he says. But Protagoras immediately drops the superhuman facet of this question, and instead chastises Socrates for speaking of pigs and baboons, which means, by the way, that this is what Socrates had in mind in speaking of perception which is below human beings. And then he said there are other stranger creatures that have perception too. He meant gods. As for Protagoras' official position, that he neither speaks nor writes about whether the gods are or not, the Protagoras by itself refutes it. And in any case, a wise man may well never speak or write about the gods, but he'll necessarily deliberate about them, if silently. Protagoras, as he appears in the pages of Plato, is remarkably modern, not to say postmodern. Many people have noted the similarities in his political doctrine, between his political doctrine and that of Hobbes, for example. I've already mentioned the respect paid him by Heidegger and Rorty. Protagoras is a hedonist, and hedonism, as you know, is a doctrine central to much of modern political thought. And like most everybody in this room, Protagoras is an atheist. If he prefers to speak and to write about something other than that, it's for reasons of self-protection. As for his most famous remark about the gods, Plato never quite quotes it. It runs something like this. About the gods, I'm not able to know whether they are or are not, given the obscurity of the matter and the brevity of human life. But Plato's account permits us to see that this is not what it's often taken to be, a nice statement of agnosticism. Instead, it's a proclamation that Protagoras knows both that and why he cannot know the being of gods. And I should say, to assert that you don't know the gods to exist, agnosticism in our sense, is for all practical purposes, for the purposes of life, a rejection of their existence. And unlike today's relativism, which so far as I can see always has a moral root, decency in the form of toleration seems to demand relativism. The ancient relativism of Protagoras is meant to serve above all a theoretical purpose. The sophistry of Protagoras is impressive, it seems to me, for at least two reasons. First, Protagoras held that the world is deeply resistant to our attempts to understand it, that there remains at the heart of things and even at the surface of things a mystery. And that's a fact that we who are so deeply influenced by the claims of modern science need to learn or relearn, I think. Second, he held that the persistence of that mystery left unrefuted those who claim access to what I'm calling special knowledge through prophecy and divination, a claim that obliterates nature or necessity. He also drew the necessary conclusion from this. Wisdom or science is finally impossible. As for philosophy, how can you really love what you see as illusory? Socrates evidently didn't share that conclusion. As he was about to declare very soon, the dramatic date of the Theaetetus is immediately before the trial, he was going to declare at his trial that wisdom is possible, at any rate human wisdom. And he evidently knew, in a manner sufficient for his life, that he had, quote, refuted the Delphic oracle. What equipped Socrates to resist the pull of the flux? This, it seems to me, is the question that Plato's presentation of the sophist prompts us to raise and to pursue, above all in the 6 other dialogues that cluster around the execution and death of Socrates. From all this, I conclude that you could do worse than becoming a sophist today in the mold of a Protagoras. You would certainly come to see what the truly foundational questions are, and who knows, you might uncover some unexpected pleasures along the way. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob, and I think we have a commentary
Oh, yes.
from Mr. Rory Schachter.
Thank you. When I was asked not that long ago to be responded on a paper that would be on the Theaetetus and the Protagoras, I was first thought maybe you should find someone else who had great familiarity with those two dialogues, but then I thought that's not fair to the person asking. And agree, but I saw the title, I was very relieved, because I hoped that I would myself live the sophistic life in responding to you. I don't know if you know that actually Harvard is a sort of traditionally an anti-Protagorean place. The Emerson Hall, when it was first being built, President Eliot was approached to put an inscription on the side, "Man is the measure of all things."
Oh, I did not know that.
He rejected it in favor of the Psalm, it's the 8th Psalm, that what is man that thou art
See,
mindful.
no one knows the psalm, but everyone knows Protagoras.
Yes, so at any rate,
He was a wise man. He knew what he was about, Mr. Allen. That was it's a blasphemous remark.
So, in any case, I thought of actually trying to take your title seriously or literally, and not simply as a marketing ploy to bring out the masses. And so, if I was going to look at this as sort of on-campus recruiting for sophistry,
Yeah.
I guess I'd have questions about this role I was auditioning for.
Yeah.
Life. I mean, the first, and again, I don't think there's a contradiction in your presentation. I think it echoes probably problems in Platonic dialogue, and then perhaps just Plato's echoing problems in the nature of things. But I mean, the most obvious or glaring issue is that you throughout refer to Protagoras as a hedonist, and also though you raise the question of him placing the good, the eidos of the good, among the things in the unknowable flux.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like a strange contradiction. It seems like the definition of a hedonist, serious hedonist anyway, is someone who claims that pleasure is the highest good. So it's hard for me, I can understand an atheist, but it's hard for me to understand how he's a hedonist. And further, regarding your marketing of the life of sophistry, I wonder what is to be gleaned from your idea that Protagoras had a taste or an inclination, those are your words, not to accede to the claims of prophets or divine revelation. What's the source of this inclination? Or as your prospective sophist here, can you even be teaching me sophistry? Wouldn't it just be a matter of whether I had the sophistic daimon? And looking through the Theaetetus very late last night, actually, I came upon 152e, which you don't mention, but there Socrates calls Protagoras a philosopher. He actually just lists him along with other pre-Socratics. He lists him along with Heraclitus and Empedocles, but not Parmenides, as believing that all things are becoming. So I mean, the question I have is whether is Protagoras a pre-Socratic who, unlike the other pre-Socratics, generally speaking, had a political philosophy, cared about politics, had a mode of self-protection, didn't need to learn from the fate of Socrates, that you had to say combine the way of Socrates with some Thrasymachus or some sophistic. Or sort of, is he on the way to Socratic political philosophy? Or what's the relation between his awareness of and response to the claims of the pious and Socrates' own? I mean, that seems to be the center of your paper is drawing me towards. And so again, I'm trying to tease out this issue of this pre-Socratic. On page 12, you're relying on Aristotle, you say philosophy or science is possible only if nature can be known to exist, if the law of necessity that brooks no interruption is set down for all time. Short aside, I would say in the God of the Perplexed, Maimonides refers to the Timaeus, where you have an idea of the sempiternity of the universe. So maybe it's too strict a definition. But in any case, I mean, the general question I have is, don't the pre-Socratics know of nature as well? I mean, isn't that something Socrates seems to grant them? And then if they know what nature is, they would know what necessity is. Wouldn't that they have already kind of refuted, at least according to the epigram, the possibility of a creative ex nihilo, creative God? Or to put it another way, is the Socratic term necessary, or are the pre-Socratic philosophers no philosophers at all? I mean, is the Socratic turn the founding of political philosophy or philosophy simply? I mean, it seems that in a way it would have to be the founding of philosophy simply if the requirements of knowing nature are meeting all of these things which Protagoras didn't seem to meet. Just move through. And then also, keeping with this tongue-in-cheek theme of my prospective career as a sophist, I mean, what would a Protagorean sophist be able to believe, say, of available philosophical doctrines, say, modern doctrines? I mean, the idea of affirming the relativity of the good and yet speaking of the good for man seems to be something that's described in great length, say, by Spinoza in the preface to the Ethics Book 4, and so that, could that provide us a way around this problem? Another sophistic remark is the sophist one who believes that what Machiavelli said when he ascribed to certain moral philosophers that the hands and tongue of men, two very noble instruments for ennobling him, would never have worked perfectly, nor let the human works gain to the height they are if they had not been driven on by necessity. So is that a kind of Protagorean remark? Is that a remark that's based on an Epimethean view of the universe? And finally, Hobbes, who I think this is the closest, not just his political idea, but also, I mean, I guess his denial of the possibility of having even an idea of God, so sort of critiquing the possibility of knowing miracles rather than the possibility of miracles. And then also, of course, Hobbes explicitly denies the idea of a summum bonum, but we haven't cast him out from the ranks of philosophers for that reason. So I just kind of tell me more about my prospective role.
Your
future.
Prospective role as a future or as a budding
sophist?
sophist?
Future sophist, if it means I'm going to be a kind of philosopher, or if sophistry can be, in Protagorean sophistry, can be clearly set off from either philosophy or Socratic political philosophy.
Right. Well, thank you. That was extremely rich and fast. So I reserve the right to come back for reminders, even though I wrote some things down. No. And it seems to me you took the spirit of my remarks exactly right, and I really don't disagree, I think, with anything you say. There were just a couple of maybe points of clarification. With regard to his hedonism, the first point is this difficulty that I'm suggesting that between the lines he's a hedonist in the Protagoras, although he doesn't want to admit that. And I'm sure that I'm positive he's a hedonist. And his denial is so everything about him is cagey, but even the denial is so cagey. Well, it would be safest for me to say merely the following. There's this peculiarity. Plato devoted 2 dialogues, or the larger part of 2 dialogues, to setting forth Protagoras' doctrine. And the first is set in such a way that Protagoras is alive. He's very old, but he's there, and at a certain point, Socrates sort of warns him to clean up his act. There's a couple of passing remarks dissing the people, the demos, and this is in democratic Athens. I would say it as an aside, by the way. It baffles me why people regard today Protagoras as a democratic theorist. He has a theory about democracy, but it's not very favorable. He makes these nasty remarks about people, and Socrates, in a way, sends some smoke signals and tells him to clean up his act. So that the Protagoras, after that point at least, the Protagoras we get in the Protagoras is not entirely frank. He's somewhat cleaned up or improved, and the main point is in the Theaetetus he's dead. And Socrates has, in a way, other fish to fry. He wants to get at this question of knowledge, I think, and to bring out the challenge of what I'll call the theological position. And one confirmation of this suggestion is that the dialogue that immediately follows the Theaetetus in the dramatic order is the Euthyphro. And the Euthyphro is, because he says at the end of the Theaetetus, I have to go to my preliminary trial for my preliminary hearing for my trial. And then we get the Euthyphro. And so you have this, what is knowledge and what is piety, back to back. So it's a confirmation of these hints which are otherwise fairly easy to miss in the Theaetetus. Protagoras is not there. And I think Socrates tries to give the absolute best position or most extreme position he can, defending philosophy or what's left of philosophy after this, in the face of this challenge. So that I think Protagoras didn't go this far. This is why he leaves it open. I think he was a hedonist, and therefore you're absolutely right. He had to have some, or believe that he had some concrete understanding of what's truly good. And while what pleases us may vary from person to person. The fact of pleasure is not negotiable as the highest good. And so that you have to abandon, I think, in the Theaetetus, if you look at the most extreme position. And I would attribute this to the fact that it's two very different dramatic contexts. The man is not there, so Socrates plays with him, his doctrine. And there's this peculiar detail about the Theaetetus. I won't go into all of it, but there's this little scene at the beginning, and we learn that Socrates took a hand in writing this. Or at any rate, one of his devoted students wrote it up, and Socrates corrected it. It's the closest thing we have to a Socratic writing, rather than a Protagorean writing. So there may be more. He's using Protagoras for his own means. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why he sometimes includes him in this group of philosophers and sometimes by himself. There's a kind of expansion and contraction. I think that's why, at any rate. He does call him a philosopher. He calls him wise, all wise, at one point, divinely wise. Very high praise. The philosophers proper are the ones most closely associated with the motion doctrine as distinguished from perception. And sometimes those are equated, sometimes they're not. You asked, so that's the long answer to the question of why is he a hedonist in the one he can't be in the other. I agree. I think that's absolutely right. And it has to do with the purpose of the differing purposes of the two dialogues. You asked me about I said something to the effect of that Protagoras, he has a theoretical bent, as do the men and the kids in the Theaetetus. They're mathematicians. This is the way they go. But that he...
Atheistic, atheistic, not just theoretical.
Protagoras.
Yeah.
And why, therefore, why does he not explain the inclination as to his resistance to the position that he knows he can't refute? It has to do with what I just said, I think, that his taste and he longs to know, to understand the world as it is, and I think he can bring himself to believe these tales, part of which he repeats, part of which he embellishes on. He's a maker of myths in Protagoras. So I would say something like a scientific attitude, a Weber or something. The third point has to do with his status as a philosopher. Yeah? And there were many sub-points, so far as I remember, of this complicated point. But the one that struck me the most was Socrates in contrast to Protagoras. Is that right?
And the pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus and Protagoras, whether if they know nature, then according to your schema, they know necessity, and then they would have to accomplish all these.
I can try to answer both elements this way. That, as I understand it, there was a kind of crisis in Socrates' life. He tells us as much in the Phaedo. And at a certain point, he was clearly a pre-Socratic. From his youth, he said he had this extraordinary desire to conduct the inquiry into nature. So all the denials are nonsense. It's just window dressing. Why does he admit it in the Phaedo? Because he's about to die. Nothing more can be, no harm, greater harm can come to him. So he lets that cat out of the bag. He was a scientist or a philosopher in this sense. But that he began to have doubts as to how much the science he knew or the philosophy he knew could really explain what it claimed to explain. On the one hand, the insight into atoms, to take an example which remains, is astounding. And that a dog, I have this Harvard student, undergrad is auditing my class, and I said, "What's a dog?" This is the character of my classes, and he said, "Well, it's an organization of atoms." But everything is an organization of atoms, and so that the explanation, the material, the efficient cause allegedly of a dog, doesn't explain the form. The form remains somehow mysterious to us and presupposed in the explanation of the atoms and their organization only make sense to us in as much as we presuppose the form. But how does the form come? How does it persist? What's behind that? That remains, this is an example of the problems that Socrates encountered. And so, on the one hand, they all shared the overwhelming desire to give an account of the world in terms of what must be, what cannot be otherwise. That is, these are all glosses on the word nature or necessity. But Socrates seems to, and they were dazzling and gave varying different hypotheses. In the first book of the Metaphysics, there's an account of these things. But Socrates remained dissatisfied with them all. They were philosophers, I think, in as much as they attempted, that they loved wisdom, that they attempted to understand the world by means of the human mind left to its own devices, and they made great strides, I think Socrates would even say. But that there still remained a presupposition in their very reliance on nature which troubled them. And if my interpretation of the Theaetetus is correct, Socrates as Protagoras saw something of the same thing and took, so to speak, a diametrically opposed solution. That he retreated to a kind of citadel of radical relativism which was impregnable, he hoped, against the claims, the apparently universal claims of those who say there are gods and that we must live in this way or not that way. You asked me what Socrates' response is. I'll limit my answer to, I mean, you already said somehow founding political philosophy. I would agree with that. The new, more serious interest in moral and political opinions. That somehow was he hoped, was a path to keeping the world from spinning, being constantly in motion. There was a kind of world which would present itself to us as a world. Here I might note the ambiguity of Protagoras' most famous statement that human being is a measure, an ambiguity which I learned from Hegel, who has a very clear statement of it in his lectures in the philosophy of history. He says that Protagoras' doctrine can be interpreted in one of two ways. That the human being in question is 300 million of each of us, the radically isolated individual. In other words, a complete relativism. But then Hegel notes there's a completely different interpretation, which was followed by Plato and others. Namely, that human being means human being as such. That there's a human world which is fundamentally common to us, and that the world becomes a world through the presence of the classifying human mind. And this seems to have been the explanation of the division which you alluded to between Parmenides on the one hand and all the other philosophers who held to the motion doctrine. And in this respect, Socrates seems to have owed something important to Parmenides, hence the Parmenides, the dialogue of Parmenides. So, in the Protagoras and the Theaetetus, there are only pointers in the direction of Socrates' usual approach. And in the Protagoras, it takes this form. Protagoras comes on strong, no gods, no justice, no piety. The moral virtues are for the sheep. But it turns out that he laughs at people, at least behind his hand, who would sacrifice their own good in the name of justice, for example. But he has a soft spot, and Socrates is better than any human being at finding your soft spot. And that proves to be courage, manliness. Why? Because he prides himself on the fact that what he does is dangerous and that he's got the guts to do it. And I won't go through all the details, but in the end, Socrates shows that he's, in his ways, Protagoras is still a moral man. That what he laughs at in the case of justice, he admires in the case of courage, which is not just the guts to pursue your own good, but the guts to go to war, as he says at one point. He admires that. He doesn't think they're foolish. So that there's a lack of moral clarity in Protagoras and the Protagoras. You're going to say something.
You're speaking of Nietzsche in this very room earlier. So is the problem then that he's an atheist with a conscience? Atheism with a conscience? Is that the problem with his atheism?
It may be a problem with his atheism more directly, or simply it's a problem with his contempt for moral things as merely conventional and therefore not really existing. It may be ultimately a problem with his piety, but isn't Nietzsche's complaint that we've retained the Christian virtue, specifically Christian virtues, while jettisoning the Christian God, and this is impossible. Whereas I don't think courage, the goodness of courage by itself, depends upon the belief in Zeus and so on. Then in the Theaetetus, what is the pointer to the peculiarly Socratic approach to these questions? There is something called the digression, which Socrates explicitly says is a digression. It's very complicated. But there, what starts it is the question, is there something just by nature, natural right? And, of course, Protagoras says no. And in there, we get a kind of demonstration before our eyes of the Socratic approach to moral questions and the seriousness with which he takes them. And in reading it this time, it's a contrast between lawyers and philosophers. But the philosophers that he sketches there are clearly sort of pre-Socratic philosophers. They don't know the way to the marketplace. They know nothing about laws and so on. They don't even know if their neighbor is a human being or some other creature. Socrates was always in the agora and so on, and asking all these questions. So it's clearly meant to highlight the newness of Socrates. And toward the end of this digression, he complains that the lawyers don't know how to sing a hymn of gods and happy men. And he proceeds to give this beautiful account of justice. And he also indicates in passing that the lawyers, who pride themselves on their being sharpies, you know, that justice is for the simps, and I'm a sharpie and clever and so on. He indicates in 3 places, if I remember correctly, that they're disappointed with that. That if you got them alone and you could ask them certain questions, they would be dissatisfied with themselves. In other words, there's a certain disappointment in their hearts at the thought that justice is bunk. And why is that significant? It's significant. That may not be a demonstration of the existence of natural right, but it is a pointer to the fact that that justice has a natural hold on our hearts, as one could put it. We need an account of justice by nature. That's the question that opens the digression, and we never get it. It's defended in terms of piety, but it's only a Socratic philosopher could give such a speech. You know, the other philosopher, properly speaking, doesn't even know of the lawyer type, whereas Socrates has an X-ray of his soul. Now, that doesn't answer the question of why this is helpful in establishing nature, or the other side of the same coin. One would have to know why that would amount to a refutation of those who claim that there are gods. That's beyond what I've said. I know that, but nonetheless, these are the pointers in these 2 dialogues toward that.
Michael Fraser.
Hi. Yes, I get to be the first to speak out after the official commentator, of course. I'm wondering about the sophistic business plan that you're advocating.
Yeah.
Said very little about the nature of the product that's actually sold to most of the customers.
Yeah.
And it's a product that has to work, right? Because it comes with a functional equivalent of a money-back guarantee. I mean, the way you mentioned that the way this money-back guarantee works depends on the piety of the people the product is being sold to.
Yeah.
But I was more interested in order for this framework to work, not only do the customers have to be pious, but the product has to function as advertised. So is there, if we are supposed to set up this business plan of teaching lots of people how to realize their political ambitions,
yeah,
while teaching one or maybe a couple of people how to be sophists like us, then we need to figure out what actually is the effective, functional way of achieving your political ambitions, which seems to meet a certain level of truth-likeness, at least under a pragmatist conception of truth is what works. A certain truthiness, I guess.
Right.
And it seems to be that unless we're customizing the product an awful lot, which sounds like an awful lot of effort, we're selling the same product to every student who comes wanting to realize their political ambitions, which comes close but doesn't quite reach the level of, a single unchanging nature. Right. So, but it can't be that we're just feeding them exoteric lies, because the thing actually works. We're not selling a false bill of goods. It comes with a guarantee, and we make a lot of money because the thing works. So, not that there's necessarily much textual evidence about what this product actually was.
That's the difficulty.
But do you have any thoughts on
Yeah. No,
what
that's
it
a good
was,
point.
or how it was consistent with the things that the sophist actually.
Right. Just for the
this-
record, you don't know me, and so you don't know my peculiar sense of humor, but I'm not actually trying to encourage you to do sophistry, although my point was that actually we can learn something important, and maybe even the most important thing, from Plato's presentation of Protagoras. So just for the record. I tried in stating what I called the political teaching, or the moral political teaching, to tease out what I could from the text. And you rightly have observed that there's not a lot of stuff there. I could compare it with Gorgias. Gorgias, who is the close, as a famous orator, is a close twin of the cousin of the sophist, according to Plato. And there we do get a long account of one of his students, namely Meno. And Meno is a mess. I mean, he goes on to have this horrible political career, and he betrays the Greeks and so on. And he boasts that he's a student of Gorgias and learned a ton from Gorgias. Gorgias, by the way, denies that he teaches virtue, which I think is true.
Well, then they wouldn't.
Well,
You'd have to give the money back under that kind of.
Well, it depends what Gorgias. I think he teaches the goodness of vice. I think what Gorgias teaches. But leaving aside, there's more evidence for Gorgias than there is for Protagoras. And it may be that it was more seductive. I don't know. I tried to deduce from the opening dramatic scene and some of the remarks that there has to be a political teaching which has to be effective. I agree. And what does he claim? I didn't quote the claim. First, Socrates tries to get him to say what it is you get if you sign up at Protagoras U for $50,000 or whatever it is. And he says, every day you're with me, you'll become better and better. That's it. And Socrates because he's still being very polite, he says, oh yes, that's wonderful, yes. Better in what way exactly? And he pushes him in his way. And finally, Protagoras says this, that, I don't know if I can do it from memory, that I'll teach you good counsel concerning your own affairs, both in the management of your own household and when it comes to the city's affairs, how to become most powerful in speaking and carrying out the things of the city. So it's clear that your own household, which is obviously to your own benefit, and he says it explicitly in his promise, and then he leaves, and then he says you can have the most power in your city. He leaves completely unstated for whose good, the good of the city or your own good. So what would he teach concretely? I tried to suggest there must be some principles of political rhetoric, how to give persuasive speeches, how to move a people to agree to your proposal, and that can be taught. There are principles of rhetoric then and now.
But it's got to be more than that.
Yeah, and there has to be
Something about what the proposal should be.
Yeah, it's very difficult, I think, for me to say on the basis of the text whether this was caution on Plato's part, he didn't want to make it too attractive, or whether Protagoras is immensely clever. He didn't know this was going to happen. It's relatively early in the morning when this takes place, and he says, "Shall I give a lecture or a myth, a logos or a myth?" And I'll give a myth. And then he gives this famous myth. Maybe he's done it before. Maybe he's done it 100 times before, but it seems to be off the top of his head. It's a creation myth, which is sort of traditional but not. And then he gives this long argument. And what he does there simultaneously, at least if I read it correctly, is that he shores up in part of his audience the conviction that you should be good and work for the city and the virtues are good, and if you're not good, then Zeus will get you. So it's perfectly respectable. It's a little unorthodox, but it's in that way perfectly respectable. But when you begin to think about it, he teaches at least two other things. That we got nothing by nature or from the gods. It was just a howling wilderness out there. And if we by our own hands hadn't discovered technology, we would be ruined. This is put in mythical terms, fire was stolen, for which, and the thief was punished. That's all you need to know about the gods and their philanthropy. And as I said in my remarks, he puts before the audience who's thinking like Alcibiades, these are the kind of things you have to say to people. Zeus will get you. You may think you can jump the turnstile in the T, but you can't, even if there's no cops. But so you get both the undermining of the doctrine and the public promotion of the doctrine. And you see the necessity to promote it at the same time. So that there's a kind of self-protection. In other words, he would have goody-goody students, presumably, who would be taught some rhetoric, they'd be taught, service to the community and so on. And then there'd be the Sharpies. They wouldn't get along too well, I assume. And the first group would, if they didn't think it was worth 50 grand but only 30, they'd swear in the temple that it was worth 30 and so on. The others, you would effect a kind of liberation. Imagine if you, for the first 18 years of your life, knew there was Zeus on Mount Olympus and so on, and he had these qualities. And someone takes you aside and says, it's all nonsense. And the pole by which you've been leading your whole life doesn't exist. If you weren't simply revolted by it, you would feel, like, I suspect, a kind of thrill and a kind of spontaneous gratitude to you. So I can't fill in, because so far as I can see, Plato doesn't fill in the specific content. I don't think he was so interested in presenting that, at least. It could be, he's, as I say, Protagoras is very clever, and I think it wouldn't take so much work to say 5 urgent topics in public policy that the United States needs to deal with: the debt, healthcare policy, Medicare, and so on. And then some principles of effective speech, which surely can be taught. And then the quote-unquote secret teaching, as it's called in the Theaetetus, which there has a kind of very theoretical character, but there's an anti-theological counterpart to it too, I think. So that's the best that I can do on the basis of the text.
As a youth, I've been thoroughly corrupted
By whom?
by the sophistic life. I can't get enough of it now.
You mean prior to this afternoon? Yes, good. I don't want to take any responsibility for this, for the corruption. Chris.
Bartlett.
Yes, thanks. What I thought was powerful about your presentation of Protagoreanism, or sophistry as Protagoreanism, was that you don't just talk about an epistemological claim about the truth conditions of statements or something like that, but about an ontological presupposition, right? And you connect that with the denial of the world. And you suggest that Protagoras is a knower. He's got big issues on his plate, and he rejects, in some sense, or is afraid of the deep theological, let's say the possibility of a real theology. And so he sort of escapes from that into a radical subjectivism. And what I'd like to hear about is, why this dialogue or these sets of dialogues? What do we learn about the path to philosophy from Protagoreanism? Because one potential criticism of your paper is that you suggest somewhat lightheartedly that we can be sophists, and then we can learn something about the fundamental questions by being sophists.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it seems that in your paper, what you present is that we learn about the fundamental questions by being characters in a Platonic dialogue, and no more than that. And that if we were actually sophists, or if we were a Protagorean, we wouldn't get there unless we had a Socrates ready at hand to help us out.
I would say... Well, maybe I'll go to your first point. Your first point, why in these dialogues is this question treated? Is that?
Well, I mean, no. Why are you so interested in these as opposed to these or something like that?
Oh. Well, I am interested in that, too.
But yeah, you're writing on Protagoras.
Yeah. Because I had a kind of affinity for the Protagoras to begin with, and then it seemed to me, I just found it absorbing. That's not an adequate answer, but it's the truth. And that the questions that it dealt with, the character of moral virtue and piety, were and are of interest to me and are questions to me, and then it seemed just logically sensible to put together the two-part presentation of Protagoras, therefore the Theaetetus.
But if you knew now what you know after that inquiry, would you be able to skip it over entirely and just directly get to the clear presentation of the theological problem? Or
I don't think so, because it, I mean, there may be other paths to the same thought. There may be, but I don't know of one in Plato that's more helpful. Let me put it this way: I mentioned the dramatic context. I don't get too complicated, but the Theaetetus, as I say, takes place near the end of Socrates' life, and it's one of a trilogy: the Theaetetus, the Sophist, and the Statesman. And those dialogues are very theoretical, extraordinarily difficult, and they seem to be completely unpolitical, with the possible exception of the Statesman. But still, they're tough-going dialogues, and Socrates all but drops out at one point, and somebody else speaks. But it's interwoven with the four dialogues that everybody knows, dealing with the accusation, beginning with the Euthyphro, through to the execution in the Phaedo. So we have the most political, riveting dialogues at the end, interwoven with these very theoretical dialogues. And it occurred to me at one point that I think, this is my hypothesis, that Plato's doing something very particular with this cluster of dialogues, which is what I'm less immediately interested in, is that cluster of 7 dialogues. It establishes beyond a shadow of a doubt that Socrates was a philosopher, a theoretical man, and not just a moral thinker. Moreover, it distinguishes him from the motion camp, Protagoras and the others, Heraclitus, on the one hand. So one pre-Socratic school. And in the Sophist and the Statesman, an Eleatic stranger comes who bears some connection to Parmenides. And so we get Socrates in his difference from one pre-Socratic school and a different pre-Socratic school. And it seems to me that in the Theaetetus, together with its, in a way, its twin, the Euthyphro, for the reason I mentioned a moment ago, the theological question is front and center. As a, to use your term, an epistemological, it is an epistemological question. It's the epistemological question, I would say, whether or not there's a God in heaven. But you also said epistemological.
Yeah, truth, conditions, and statements.
Yeah. I mean, what is knowledge? That would be regarded today as an epistemological question. But I'm suggesting the epistemological question. Well, ontology too, but leaving that aside for the minute. And so I think one has to put the 7 together. The very political, moral teaching, the star of which is the Apology of Socrates, in which he explains his life to a public, in which he explains how he grappled with a certain prophecy or oracle, more precisely. And it seems when you put them together, you begin to see what was peculiar about Socrates or his achievement. I mean, ultimately, one has to go to all 35, I'm sure, but I just assume that. I don't know it. So that's why I'm interested in this question, and I don't think one could skip these. I mean, maybe, but on the basis of my experience or my knowledge, I would say that it's particularly powerfully presented here. And it's presented, and I would say my interest in sophistry and my jocular exhortation to you to consider sophistry is that I think Plato thought there's something serious about it. The most serious of them, like Protagoras. Yeah, he gets improved in the Protagoras, and he gets improved, I think, probably dramatically in the Theaetetus, but there's something, these guys were in the big leagues. I mean, you could compare this with, there are 3 sophists who are presented most in the dialogues. There's Protagoras, who appears in the Protagoras, and then Protagoras and Hippias. I think Leo Strauss points this out somewhere, that the highest praise goes to Protagoras. The next greatest praise goes to Protagoras. And I'm afraid Hippias just is the brunt of jokes. And so we get no dialogue on the Protagoras, 1 on the Protagoras, and 2 on the Hippias. So we get the least impressive. But if you look for most treatment of the least impressive, although if you include the Theaetetus, that's not true in terms of page numbers of pages. Do you want to come back? There's something I think I probably didn't answer in your question.
Not necessarily, but your interest in Protagoras is primarily as a character in the dialogues?
No. It's what the questions are that concern him. And no, I mean, you know.
So that's the right path for you? I mean, from a sort of skeptical relativism on a sort of dogmatism towards philosophy? This is, like, I'm just asking about your taste now. Is this...
My taste?
Yes. Do you think that that's the most adequate path?
No, I mean, I did not begin life as a relativist, and in a way, certainly his theoretical position is so sophisticated, I still don't understand it. No, I suspect, like most people, I had deep moral concerns and political concerns, but I also had some doubts about them, their adequacy, and they at a certain point seemed to me to be prejudices, and that was troubling to me because I cared about them. And that, I would say, is an attraction to Plato more generally. Insofar as I became alive to the possibility of Socrates and that he led a way of life which may be the best way of life, there are competitors in the dialogues, and one of them are the sophists, and Protagoras is the most impressive who's presented at any length. So it was a part of that question of what I ought to do with my life. And I do think, just to repeat my main point, that I think Plato encourages us to take Protagoras seriously. You know, he bashes them, and Protagoras ultimately, certainly in the Protagoras, he doesn't look very good. He loses, Socrates wins. But Plato paid him a high compliment, I would say.
The very phrase way of life seems to be more Socratic than Protagorean.
Yeah,
I think
that's...
It's a kind of life.
Yeah.
So that means there are kinds that have stability, or if not permanence. And it's an object of a choice that you can make rather than a necessary,
I mean, insofar as
necessitated decision.
Yeah, insofar as Protagoras, the extreme version of Protagoras, there are so many versions, insofar as the extreme version could make an argument, could sketch a world, and you're attracted to that sketch, you could enter into the charmed circle, I suppose, of an extreme relativism and begin to see some similar perceptions as he does. But
would he have an expression that would substitute for way of life?
Not that occurs to me. I mean, this goes back to the interesting and important question about what really would he teach. Does he say, be like me? I'm struck by the fact that of the very many students attracted to him, exactly one is a budding sophist, or 99% are not. But you can become a sophist in his circle. There's no Antimoirus dialogues, and he never wrote anything, so far as I know. Certainly nothing that has survived, so we don't know the content of that kid's head.
You referred in passing to a standard criticism of sophistry, and one standard criticism of sophist is that a sophist is someone who claims to know something that he doesn't know, and the difference between this, the term sophist and philosopher seems to indicate that the sophist is a wise person, and a philosopher is someone who loves wisdom, and which means he doesn't have wisdom, because otherwise you wouldn't be in search of it. Right. And I was intrigued by your description of Protagoras, because it seems to suggest the exact opposite. That the way you describe Protagoras is as someone who knows less than philosophers, and he knows less than philosophers. And so I was curious to know whether you think this view of sophistry, whether it's adequate or not.
I would put it exactly as you did. In fact, it was the formulation running through my head as you were speaking, that he knows, I mean, again, the extreme version, if that's what we're to identify him with, that he doesn't know very much and maybe not anything, and he knows that, and even could give some explanation as to why. So if Socrates is famous as the philosopher of ignorance, he's nothing compared to Protagoras' position. I think the stress in Plato's presentation of Protagoras, the character, is on money. That the wages, the high fees, Yes, it's. I think he's needling him, and that there is a suggestion that somehow what's deep in his soul is really a desire for a kind of fame and some money, and that's why I presented the. And I've heard this in other places too. I read this too. The standard criticism of sophistry would be that they do know things and they are impressive, but they subordinate it all. They harness it to something which is unimpressive.
So fancy hedonism is really vulgar hedonism underneath.
Fancy being
The position of relativism and underneath money's good.
Yeah. I think he was very wealthy, and that's mentioned several times in Plato. So he wants us to know that fact about him. But to go back to your formulation, Master, I don't know. I mean, it does seem to me that he can't be a philosopher on the basis of his position, if I've understood the extreme position, because nothing can be known, which is not the Socratic position, as I tried to indicate at the end. So there may have been thinkers, philosophers, who claimed a little bit too much. They were too confident in their position as regards nature in particular. And then there's Protagoras at the other end, who didn't claim to know really apparently anything, and was aware of that fact and could explain it to the extent that it can be put in speech. And then there's Socrates in the middle, who was sure that he knew certain things, including that his life was the best life, apparently. Now the question would be, and this would also go back to one of your points, what did he share, what's the fundamental thing Socrates shared with the other pre-Socratics that distinguished all of them from Protagoras, as a sophist, as distinguished from the philosophers? I think it has to do with the makeup of the soul and what really moved him, not a longing to figure out the damn thing, but perhaps to be celebrated and to have a kind of pleasure or comfort. And his position, I think, which doesn't make science possible. Whereas the others, at least attempted, long to stake out a position which would make science possible. That's the best that I can do. Yeah.
Sorry, might prove to be a very minor point. It was just sparked by.
Those are the hardest questions to answer.
So I'm not familiar with the Theaetetus at all, I have to admit. I'm relatively familiar with the Protagoras, and in part that's thanks to your own translation. I've enjoyed using it as a foil as I work through the Greek.
Oh, thanks.
You're a pleasurable combatant. But
Uh-oh.
well, it's always, what do we make of this one line?
Yeah.
But from the Theaetetus, you're getting this idea of the impossibility of knowledge of science, correct? But then I wonder if that really does travel to the Protagoras, how much we can identify Protagoras Theaetetus with Protagoras.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of the passage in the Protagoras that kind of gets the courage argument going, the entire last extended section, where Socrates says, well, what about the well divers, the ones who know what they're doing, as opposed to the ones who don't? Well, what about the horsemen, the ones who... And so Protagoras wants to admire the ones who know what they're doing and are going to succeed, and he wants to condemn the ones who are overbold and who are going to fail. Right. The shieldsmen who charge into battle and just get themselves killed.
Don't know what they're doing. Yeah.
So we do have, returning to Michael's point, some real admiration for competence, and some real idea that there are certain practices that are better than others, at least in their success rate. So maybe that, I don't really know where I was going with that, but do you see a tension between the Theaetetus and that, or am I...
I'd have to think more about it. I would say with regard to that passage, I interpret it maybe a little bit differently than you do. You're right, it's the beginning of the discussion of courage. And there, Protagoras is still, there have been some hot spots, but things are basically fine. He's managed to recover himself from some attacks. And in fact, he's just had a kind of victory, if I remember correctly, that on the question of hedonism. And then Socrates, well, that's a little bit later. But anyway, go on. I'll go on. That, you said we admire competence. I agree, but that's not courage. In other words, he's still there, I think, praising, Protagoras is still praising there, an understanding of courage, which is knowing what you have to do to serve your own good. Right? So somebody who is a soldier, one of his examples, who goes into battle without knowledge, he does not admire, that's foolish, it's crazy. You know, I could give this example, that if there's, you know, a box with wires sticking out of it and it's beginning to tick, you know, and to save the class, everyone leaves and I attempt to defuse the bomb. I've never done this before. I don't know what I'm doing. Meanwhile, the Harvard faculty, the grounds crew, there's an ex-bomb disposal guy who's had 30 years of experience, you know, and he looks at the box and he says, that's an X-24, let me get my pliers. And he goes down and poop and gets the green wire and everything's fine. We admire his competence and we're grateful for it. But between us, who's more courageous? I would say I am. The person is, who the other person is. Because I don't know, and it's because I'm willing to risk my own good for the sake of everyone else, that I think we'd admire it. And officially at that early stage, he would say, I'm crazy. The bomb disposal guy, okay, fine. I mean, it's still a bad line of work, but still, that's admirable, or that's sensible. And that's a problem. He can't stick to that. If he could stick to that, then he'd be fine. But actually, he admires the gutsy guy. You know, at one point he says, yeah, but the courageous go to war and the cowards run away. But from his principles, if the battle is bad and you can possibly get away, you run away. I mean, it might make life in the community hard and so on. You're branded.
Yeah.
But that's a calculation of one's own advantage and not what's noble.
I don't have a clear opinion on his commitment to courage or not courage in that dialogue.
Yeah.
But at least the example of the coward and the running away question, it seems that at that point in the dialogue, he's in a position where he could not possibly follow his principles to the conclusion and say that it's better and more courageous to run away because you're saving yourself.
He can't think it or he can't say it.
He can't say it
Yeah.
because of the public arena, because of all these reasons. He'd be undercutting the kind of project that he's attempting in the great speech.
So the question in a way, that final section I would say is, what's in his guts, his heart? Is it just prudence? I think he gets mad. And that's when the conversation shuts down. There have been a couple of tense moments before Socrates even gets up at one point. But I think at this point that's it. No more. We're done. So I think it's a pointer to a sensitive spot with him. And it's not just prudence. But your point is well taken. He couldn't say it openly. All right.
I'm wondering...
Could you give your name, please?
Oh,
Sorry.
Arthur Schuster.
Postdoc at BC.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you couldn't make the case for Protagoras, for Protagoras' position as superior to that of Socrates on the basis of your argument in this way, that whereas both Protagoras and Socrates accept the unavailability of knowledge, Protagoras doesn't want to show that his life is the best way of life, whereas Socrates does. And so doesn't that make Protagoras' position rather more attractive? Aside from the issue of his soft spot as regards courage that you just remarked on, but then with regard to that, couldn't you say that if Socrates could take the time to pull Protagoras aside in private and just say, look, you have this, you've pretty much seen through conventional morality adequately, but then with regard to courage, you haven't quite thought things through, but here's where you're going off track. And wouldn't Protagoras then say, oh, okay, thanks, Socrates? So that aside, I mean, I'm just wondering if you couldn't make a very strong case for Protagoras on the basis of precisely what you're arguing.
Yeah, but I deny your premise.
Okay.
It was a great question, but I deny your premise. That Socrates and Protagoras agree that no knowledge is available. That's why I said toward the end of my remarks that in a few days Socrates will proclaim that wisdom, that he's wise, with many important qualifications, but there's a kind of wisdom available, human wisdom, which is available to us. And yeah, you could say, well, that's knowledge of ignorance, but I think when you unpack that's a very substantial claim to knowledge.
But you also said that neither Protagoras nor Socrates can refute the challenge of revelation.
I don't think I said that.
Oh, okay. But I thought, isn't, you know, you're
In my,
suggesting-
do you mean in my paper or in my remarks after?
Well, I mean, I don't, well, I'm not sure, but I got the sense that what at least from the fact that you're sort of,
I mean, in my paper, I said, if I can interrupt, toward the end of the paper, I said that Socrates, so far as I can tell, resists the pull of the flux. Why or on what grounds, whether they're adequate grounds, is the question at the heart of these dialogues, this cluster of dialogues, I think, or one way to put that question. So I raised it as I pointed to a certain fact, I think, which is a fact, that he was not a radical relativist, or even in the motion camp, I think, that he owed something more to Parmenides. But I left as an open question how, in response to some questions, I pointed to the pointers in the Protagoras and the Theaetetus that suggest the kind of inquiry he began. But no, I would not say, as far as I can tell, I would not say that he and Socrates agree about the unavailability of knowledge, and I would not agree that he thought he didn't have a response adequate for life to those who would deny nature.
so could I just sort of ask a simple follow-up question, which is, well, what then, could you give some indication of what you think is the basis for Socrates' claim to know that his life is the best life, or you know, his claim to know that he knows nothing, or any kind of knowledge? What would that be?
I would just limit myself to saying that I think it has something to do with the question of evidence. What is the evidence for the view that the order which we observe in the world carries an asterisk, and if you read the asterisk, it says for the time being, or only for now, or it could change like that. And there's evidence for the existence of nature, which is not a demonstration. So what one would have to then examine the evidence for the other side in a new, more serious way. And so far as I can see, where do you get this evidence? You don't get it in a lab. You get it by speaking to people who know that this is so, who've had experiences that it's so. It seems to me the only lab one could have is the marketplace, so to speak.
Yes.
I'm Dan, student at Boston College. I just wanted to connect that to Professor Benegar's point. I was curious if you could say that Protagoras does claim to know more than Socrates, at least from the get-go, if he claims to know that he does not know, or cannot know. Is it different to claim that one knows that one cannot know and to claim that one knows that one does not know?
These are the sorts of head-spinning questions that you begin to think about when you're trying to think about a consistent extreme relativism, at least that's what happens to me. And it's very difficult to do, to get your head into that space, as the young people say today. And it's difficult to do. I think he would have to qualify it completely by saying this is how the world presents itself to me. How it presents itself to you, I couldn't possibly say. And there may be gods and flying creatures, and this comes up in the dialogue. I just have no evidence of this, I mean, there is a doctrine, that's true. This is the difficulty I tried to state toward the beginning of my remarks, that it's, and why the elaboration keeps shifting, that it's an attempt to put before our eyes something to give us the flavor of the doctrine, that you go to grab something and it moves, it changes. And so it's very difficult for me, at least, to give us a simply clear and persuasive account of the actual content of the doctrine. Because the content of the doctrine is that the world isn't a world because it's constantly changing, you and I both. There's a stream of sense data. Now, we don't have a clue what causes it. All we can do is say what we're sensing. I don't know.
Well, I mean, on this point, I was puzzled by the anti-theological kind of conclusions that come out of your reading near the end, where you say the strong version of his relativism then is not so much to defend philosophy as to fend off belief. And I think you said faith when you said it publicly here. that's clear to me what that would mean in terms of fending off dogmatic universalism as a kind of public faith. But it seems to me that there's a converse dynamic that operates straightforwardly, which is if at the heart of things everything's a mystery, then there's this opening for mysticism where it seems almost necessary to regard my perceptions and desires as divine revelation. Or
Right.
there's a, and this kind of plays the Maimonides quote at the outset, if the world is actually one of natural necessity all the way down, the notion of divine agency and revelation is excluded. So that kind of pure philosophy.
I'm sorry, divine agency?
Or the divine.
Oh, yes. No, you're right.
So there's a way in which
Yeah.
actually a pure natural world, intelligible to philosophy, is itself an atheism. And a world of flux almost demands a radical, and I mean Heidegger and Nietzsche are both wrestling with this as
Right.
well, but a radical kind of,
Evil genius.
you know, necessity of revelation coming. I mean, maybe there's no universalism to it.
I agree completely, but with just one addition, and that is I think Protagoras' hope is it doesn't apply to me.
Right, yeah, sure.
So you have these visions, well, I can't deny that you have. You hear voices and so on. I don't hear them. And this is further proof that you feel the cold wind, I don't. There's no there to which I have access. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that it leaves open your experiences, unrefuted. But that's in a way the official position.
And so there's a humility that comes out of. I mean, does that lead him a kind of epistemic humility then, or is it just there's a lot of people out there.
No,
that
because
have private,
I don't think so necessarily, because everyone is in, I think he thinks everybody, so far as I can tell, my perceptions tell me that everybody would be in this position, or at any rate I have no need to bow to anybody else's position. So in that respect, it's maybe not so humble. It's hard to put humility and Protagoras together, but maybe one can. Sure. John.
When we consider how much is on
John
the line,
Hungerford.
Oh, sorry, John. Yeah, grad student at BC. I mean, it seems like when there's so much on the line, that begins to seem like a strange position to take. Protagoras is, because it seems that if there is a divine agent, that would make a very big difference to you, especially if it could have some effect on how you live after you die or something like that. So, given that, it seems that Protagoras' sort of rejection of it, where does that come from? Is that, I mean, this is going back to, I think, Professor Benegar's question. Is it really the case that Protagoras recognizes the limits of his knowledge adequately? It seems that is he not examining the possibility of a God because he just can't think of how to do it, or is there something else going on?
This may get to the question which we raised about. I had an admittedly strange formulation in the paper, something about, but perhaps as a matter of taste or inclination, he doesn't accede to the view of the world that there are gods. He's a kind of scientific type. Now that by itself is completely inadequate, I think, but it may nonetheless be true. And so he resisted this thought, and are you suggesting that fine, he retreats to what I called the citadel of extreme relativism, and then he's punished for eternity?
Right.
Isn't he? Is he really taking that possibility seriously?
Right. Why does he retreat?
I think he deals with it less. I think he deals with it as a theoretical question, rather than feeling it in his bones as a sinner. That's my guess. It would go together with a certain lightness, let's say, in moral matters. It's hard to see in Protagoras. I mean, we meet him when he's at the very end of his career. He boasts of how long he's been doing it, so I don't know. But maybe as a young man, he felt this more. But there's a kind of, I won't say frivolity, that's too strong, but a kind of, he dismisses these things rather quickly. the moral concerns, I would say. So I don't know beyond that. So it's a theoretical question for him, and more, you could approach it either from the point of view of God, or I found it more helpful for students typically today who don't have that experience typically directly, to approach it from the question of causality. And I suspect that's how he approaches the question, from the question of causality. But your point is well taken. I mean, why? He doesn't claim to know that they're wrong. So if he met a Moses, and Moses said, read this, he would be unmoved. But I now I see this is good. I mean, whether that's humanly adequate. It may be sort of intellectually adequate, but is it humanly adequate?
Well, I don't see that it could be theoretically adequate. It seems that in saying that, you're at least admitting that there is an investigation that could be taken.
No, I don't know if he would do that, because I'm locked into the world of my individual perceptions, and when I perceive God, I'll let you know. Husserl said something to this effect once. If there's a datum God, we will analyze it. But he denied that there's such a datum.
I think we have to close. I'd like to announce that either there's a reception or there isn't. But we're very grateful to you, Bob. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Harvey. Thank you.